Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we will journey through the corridors of ancient Rome, following the life of one of history's most fascinating emperors. A tale of power, fear, and ambition unfolds, a story whispered through the ages, now told for your calm and wonder. Before we begin, take a deep breath, relax, and if you enjoy traveling through history with us, consider subscribing. Let's walk together through shadows, whispers, and the quiet echoes of a long-gone empire. The night in Rome shimmered with the orange glow of 1,000 oil lamps, and in one of the marble villas near the Palatine Hill, a young boy lay awake. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, though the world would one day know him as Nero. He was only 10, yet his life was already tangled in the quiet whispers of ambition. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, the proud sister of Emperor Caligula, often stood by his bedside, her voice low and commanding. She told him he was destined for greatness, not merely to live under emperors, but to rule over them. Nero's father had died when he was still a child, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty and debts. But Agrippina was not a woman to fade into shadows. She remarried strategically, climbing back toward the heart of Roman power. Her eyes, cold and gleaming like polished obsidian, were always on the throne. And through her, the boy began to see the empire not as a vast dominion of marble and law, but as something alive, breathing, dangerous. Each day, Nero studied music and philosophy under the stern eyes of his tutors. They taught him the words of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who spoke of reason and virtue. Nero listened, but deep inside, he was more fascinated by rhythm, performance, the art of being adored. In the marble corridors, he would hum to himself, the sound soft and haunting, unaware that one day his voice would echo through history, both as beauty and destruction. At night, when Rome grew still, Nero would climb to the balcony. He looked down upon the city's lantern-lit streets, imagining that all those tiny lights belonged to souls he could someday command. And from somewhere deep within the palace, Agrippina's footsteps echoed, steady, deliberate, as if reminding him, destiny is not given. It must be taken. The marble halls of the Palatine glittered under torchlight as Agrippina moved like a shadow among Rome's most powerful men. Her beauty was not soft, it was sharp, deliberate, calculated. Each gesture, each smile, carried the weight of purpose. After years of exile and disgrace under her brother Caligula's chaotic rule, she had returned to the city, determined to reclaim what was stolen from her, not just honor, but influence. Her eyes were now fixed upon one man, Emperor Claudius. He was older, awkward in speech, often underestimated. Yet behind his stutter and scholarly air, he held the might of the empire. Agrippina knew how to approach him, not with seduction alone, but with intellect, grace, and the perfect illusion of loyalty. Within months, the palace began to whisper of her charm, her poise, her uncanny ability to say what Claudius needed to hear. Meanwhile, Nero, her young son, watched as his world transformed. He moved from modest estates into palaces lined with gold. He dined beside senators and generals, his mother always at his side, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if to remind the world, "This boy is my creation." Nero studied his mother closely. He saw how words could wound more deeply than blades, how silence could command more respect than shouting. In time, Agrippina's influence grew so powerful that even Claudius, cautious and wary, began to rely on her. She spoke of unity, of restoring the dignity of Rome's imperial bloodline. She played her part so perfectly that when she suggested the possibility of marriage, no one dared call it treason. And so it happened, Agrippina became Empress of Rome. Nero was now the adopted son of the emperor, granted the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The boy who once dreamed beneath the flicker of lamplight was now heir to the world's greatest empire. But power, even when inherited, has a price. In the soft glow of his new chambers, Nero could hear the quiet hum of Rome beyond the walls, the murmur of ambition, jealousy, and fate. And in the stillness, his mother's voice lingered, "Remember, my son, everything they give you, they can take away." In the grand marble chambers of the Palatine Palace, Emperor Claudius began to dream uneasy dreams. He saw shadows behind every pillar, whispers curling through the air like smoke. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of age, of sleeplessness, but slowly, he began to notice the pattern. Every decision he made now seemed to carry Agrippina's signature. Ministers once loyal to him now bowed first to her. Petitions were approved only after she had smiled. Even his meals, his robes, his audiences were quietly arranged according to her will. Claudius was not a fool, though many had long believed him one. Beneath his stooped frame and cautious words, there lived the mind of a scholar who had studied the histories of kings and empires. He knew the pattern of ambition, how it could bloom behind the softest of smiles. And when he looked into Agrippina's calm, unwavering gaze, he began to see the outlines of his own end reflected there. Nero, meanwhile, thrived under his mother's guidance. Now 16, he walked through the forum with the poise of a prince, his golden cloak trailing behind him, the people bowing as he passed. Yet within him stirred a confusion he could not name. The philosopher Seneca, his new tutor, spoke to him of moderation, virtue, and the harmony of the soul. But Agrippina whispered of legacy, of blood, of destiny that allowed no hesitation. "Virtue," she said one evening as they looked out over the torchlit city, "is for men who can afford weakness. You, my son, must learn control." That night, Claudius called for his most trusted freedman, Narcissus. "She has gone too far," the emperor murmured. "Agrippina wants not a husband, but a throne. I have seen it in her eyes." Narcissus nodded, grave. "Then act, Caesar, before it is too late." But Claudius hesitated. The woman he feared was also the woman who had restored him, who had given him new life after years of ridicule. And Nero, bright, promising Nero, he had grown to love as his own son. Still, as autumn crept over Rome, the emperor began to draft decrees in secret. Decrees that would name his biological son Britannicus as heir once again. And somewhere beyond the marble walls, Agrippina learned of it. Her hand trembled as she set down the letter. For the first time, her reflection in the polished bronze mirror looked unfamiliar, less empress, more predator-cornered. Winter settled over Rome like a silken shroud. The marble halls of the palace grew cold, and torches burned low as rumors spread through the city, whispers that Emperor Claudius had begun to doubt his wife. Agrippina heard them all. Each murmur was another thread in the tapestry she was weaving, one that would end with her son on the throne, no matter the cost. Claudius had changed. He no longer sought her counsel at supper, his letters were sealed more tightly, his guards less familiar. Agrippina's attendants noticed, too, that the emperor now dined with his son Britannicus more often, laughing, speaking freely, like a man beginning to see the shape of betrayal around him. Agrippina understood the unspoken message: Nero's star was fading. But she had not climbed to such heights to be cast aside. Rome itself, she told herself, had chosen her. She was the blood of Augustus, the niece of Caligula, the daughter of Germanicus. It was her right to rule, even through her son. Her weapon would be patience, and a mind as sharp as a blade. She began to host small, private banquets, inviting physicians, philosophers, and even the court's best poisoners, discreetly, of course. Among them was a woman named Locusta, infamous for her mastery of subtle death. Locusta's potions did not foam or burn, they whispered through the blood like secrets. One touch, one sip, and days later, the victim would fall quietly, as though struck by nature itself. Agrippina listened carefully as the woman spoke of doses and antidotes, of wines that masked bitterness. She asked no questions, only smiled, her mind tracing every word. Soon after, Claudius announced a grand feast in honor of Britannicus's coming of age. Agrippina saw her opportunity take form like smoke solidifying into shape. The emperor would dine, laugh, and drink, and in his cup, she would pour the future. On the evening of the feast, the palace glittered. Musicians played softly, torches cast golden light across marble walls. Claudius raised his cup to toast his sons, his voice trembling with pride and age. "To Rome's tomorrow," he said. Agrippina's gaze never left him. She smiled, serene, as he drank. The next morning, the emperor's voice was gone, replaced by a cough that tore at his chest. His servants rushed to his side. Physicians came, offered herbs and prayers. But his eyes, once bright with suspicion, now dimmed with confusion and pain. Within days, Claudius was dead. Rome awoke to mourning. Agrippina, cloaked in black, stood at his funeral, her tears falling like pearls. But behind the veil, her eyes gleamed with victory. The Senate met in haste, and when dawn broke, trumpets sounded over the forum. Nero was emperor. The morning Rome crowned Nero was unlike any other. The air trembled with excitement, the streets alive with chants and flowers. From the steps of the Senate to the marble pillars of the Palatine Hill, the city glowed in gold and crimson. People pressed forward to see the boy emperor, 17 years old, radiant beneath the laurel crown, his tunic glinting like sunlight. When he appeared, the crowd erupted. "Ave, Nero! Ave Caesar!" they cried. The name rolled through the forum like a wave. For a moment, even the marble seemed to breathe. But behind the triumphal glow stood Agrippina, cloaked in the shadow of a column. Her smile was proud yet tight, her hands clasped together as if to hold the empire steady. She had done it, against every enemy, every whisper, every law of nature. Her son now ruled the world. At the ceremony's end, Nero approached her and bowed his head, a gesture rehearsed, but not without sincerity. "Mother," he said softly, "it is your victory as much as mine." Agrippina's eyes flickered. "No," she thought. "It is mine entirely." In the months that followed, Rome flourished under the illusion of peace. Nero's early decrees, guided by his tutors Seneca and Burrus, were gentle, wise, and surprisingly just. Taxes were eased, public performances funded, and justice softened. The people adored him for it. Statues of Nero rose in marketplaces, garlanded with olive leaves and ribbons. But within the palace, the balance of power trembled. Agrippina still sat behind the throne, literally. When Nero received ambassadors or generals, she often appeared beside him, veiled yet unmistakable, her voice calm and commanding. Seneca disapproved quietly, Burrus avoided her gaze. Rome's senators began to murmur that the empire now had not one ruler, but two. And Nero, young, uncertain, craving approval, began to feel the weight of her presence pressing upon him. He tried to distract himself. He turned to music, poetry, and the theater. At night, the palace halls echoed with the sound of his lyre, soft and melancholic. Sometimes he performed for a small circle of friends, his voice trembling but passionate, his fingers delicate upon the strings. Agrippina watched these indulgences with growing irritation. A ruler is not an actor, she warned him. The people will love you less for it. Nero smiled faintly. Perhaps, mother, he said, they will love me more. That night, when he sang again, the applause of courtiers filled the room. But beneath it, Agrippina's silence was louder than any sound. It was the beginning of a fracture, small, almost invisible, between mother and son. A fracture that, with time, would split the empire in two. Spring returned to Rome, and with it, a new confidence in Nero's step. The boy who once hesitated before the Senate now spoke with clarity, his speeches sharpened by Seneca's elegant phrasing. He smiled more, laughed more, and began to summon advisers without first seeking his mother's approval. Agrippina noticed every change. The distance between them grew not in miles but in moments, small hesitations, unfinished sentences, doors closed more often than before. At dinners, Nero now sat surrounded by friends rather than his mother. Poets, musicians, actors, men Agrippina considered unworthy of his station. They filled the hall with laughter and verse, drinking too much, talking too freely. When Agrippina entered, the air would shift, her presence, cold and exacting, dimmed every smile. She tried to remind him of his duty, of the empire's fragility, of the enemies watching for weakness. But Nero's mind was elsewhere. He longed for freedom, for the feeling of being adored for himself rather than as her creation. One evening, as the sunset painted the Tiber gold, Nero stood at the balcony of his chambers. "Mother," he said softly, without turning, "when you look at me, do you see me, or only your reflection?" Agrippina's voice trembled, though her face remained stone. "You are what I have made you. That should be enough." But for Nero, it wasn't. The next morning, she arrived at the imperial audience chamber as usual, only to find her chair removed from beside the throne. The attendants avoided her gaze. Nero entered, greeted the ambassadors, and began the session without acknowledging her. It was a silent declaration, but Rome heard it loudly. The Empress Mother was no longer part of the Emperor's shadow. Agrippina withdrew to her private villa by the river, her heart filled not with sorrow but with calculation. She had faced exile, betrayal, and loss before. She would not be erased by her own son. As night fell, she whispered to her confidant, "He forgets that the empire may have crowned him, but it was I who built the crown." And somewhere deep within the palace, Nero raised his cup and smiled, the taste of defiance as intoxicating as wine. Nero's nights grew longer, his parties louder. The palace that once echoed with the disciplined footsteps of guards now trembled with the sound of flutes and laughter. Rome adored its young emperor, handsome, generous, alive. He hosted games, sponsored plays, and even appeared in public wearing the robes of a performer. Senators frowned, but the people cheered. For the first time in generations, the emperor felt human, one of them. But Agrippina, watching from her villa, saw something darker. Freedom, she knew, was a drug, and her son was already addicted. She sent letters, each colder than the last, warning him of enemies who flattered only to betray. Nero did not answer. Instead, he drew closer to a woman named Poppaea Sabina, beautiful, intelligent, and dangerously ambitious. Poppaea whispered to him the words he longed to hear, that he was misunderstood, that his mother's shadow still clung to him like a curse. "Rome will not see you as your own man," she told him one evening, her fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "Not until she is gone." The suggestion was soft, almost like a lullaby. But it took root in Nero's heart. Meanwhile, Agrippina tried one final move. She appeared unannounced at the palace gates, demanding an audience. When Nero finally met her, her tone was not pleading, it was commanding. "You forget, my son," she said, her eyes sharp as daggers, "that the same people who crowned you could just as easily lift another. Britannicus's death spared you, but others will not." Nero's face hardened. "Are you threatening the Emperor of Rome?" "I am reminding him," she replied quietly, "that an emperor without his mother is only a boy in a crown." When she left, the chamber fell silent. Nero sat alone, staring at the marble floor. That night, he called for Seneca. "Tell me," Nero asked, "can a mother's love become treason?" Seneca hesitated, then said softly, "Only when love begins to rule." Outside, the Tiber whispered under the moonlight. Inside, the seeds of tragedy had begun to bloom. A grand feast was held in the imperial palace, its halls perfumed with myrrh and lined with garlands. Nero, radiant in a robe of deep purple, reclined among senators and courtiers, his laughter rising above the music. The golden plates gleamed, the wine never stopped flowing, yet beneath the glitter, unease simmered. Agrippina had not been invited. For the first time since her son's ascent, she was absent from the emperor's table. Rome whispered, some called it a scandal, others a signal. Without her presence, Nero seemed lighter, freer. But those close to him saw the flicker in his eyes when her name was spoken, the kind of fear that wears the mask of defiance. As the night deepened, Poppaea Sabina leaned close to him. "You dine like a god," she said softly, but still she watches from afar. "She will not rest until she rules again." Nero smiled faintly, though his hands trembled around the goblet. "Then perhaps," he murmured, "she must be made to rest." The words were spoken like a jest, but the air grew still, as if the marble walls themselves had heard. Across the city, Agrippina dined alone in her villa. The candles burned low, her servants silent. She traced her finger along the rim of her wine cup, deep in thought. The boy she had made emperor was slipping beyond her grasp. Still, she believed she could reach him, a mother's conviction stronger than fear. But Rome, that vast and hungry beast, had already chosen its story. And in that story, there was room for only one ruler. When morning came, Nero ordered a new ship to be built. "For my mother," he said, smiling to his architects. As a token of reconciliation. No one dared to ask why the vessel's hull was designed to break apart in the sea. It was a radiant evening when Agrippina received her son's message, an invitation to celebrate their renewed harmony at the seaside villa of Baiae. The tone was warm, even affectionate, a gesture of peace. She hesitated only briefly before accepting. Hope, after all, is a stubborn flame. The journey began under a silver sky. As Agrippina stepped aboard the splendid new vessel Nero had gifted her, she marveled at its beauty, ivory-decked, adorned with garlands, the sails catching the sunset like ribbons of fire. Nero had not come to see her off. He remained in his palace, pacing, drinking, listening to the slow ticking of a clock he hated for its honesty. Out at sea, the wind turned gentle, the water calm. Agrippina sat upon the deck, her eyes tracing the horizon. For a moment, she felt almost at peace. Then, a sharp crack. A sound beneath her feet, like bones breaking. The ship shuddered, splintered. Screams rose into the night as the hull began to give way. Servants fell into the dark water, their torches extinguished one by one. Agrippina, struck but conscious, clung to a fragment of timber. Around her, chaos, shouts, the hiss of waves swallowing life. She did not cry out her son's name. Instead, she whispered to herself, "So this is his love." Fishermen found her at dawn, drenched and bruised, but alive. When word reached Nero that his mother had survived the accident, he turned pale as wax. "She lives," he whispered. Seneca said nothing. Poppaea smiled faintly. That night, Nero could not sleep. The sound of the sea haunted him, soft and endless, like a mother's voice that refuses to die. When Agrippina returned to shore, the rumor moved faster than the tide. The emperor's mother had survived the sea's betrayal. The story spread through Rome like a ghost tale whispered in every forum and bathhouse. The gods themselves had spared her. Agrippina's servants carried her to her villa at Antium, her body bruised but her eyes burning bright. She said little, only that she had been blessed by Neptune. Yet beneath her calm, she knew the truth, the ship had not broken by chance. The betrayal was written in the very timbers. She sent a message to her son. Not an accusation, but a quiet, deliberate statement. "I am alive. And I forgive you." When Nero read the letter, his breath caught. Forgiveness, the most terrifying gift of all. His advisors urged calm. Seneca spoke of prudence, Burrus counseled restraint. But the court began to murmur. Some said Agrippina plotted revenge, others claimed she sought to rally the Praetorians. Her name became a shadow that lengthened behind Nero wherever he went. One night, Poppaea found him pacing again, his face pale with sleeplessness. "She will always live in your shadow," she said softly. "Even now, they call her the true ruler." Nero turned toward her, eyes hollow. Then, he said, she must be unmade. Outside, thunder rolled over the Bay of Naples, as if the gods themselves were warning him that no son could kill a mother and still rule in peace. But Nero was no longer listening. It was spring when Nero's patience finally broke. The empire smelled of orange blossoms, yet in the emperor's heart there was only rot. He summoned Anicetus, the admiral who had built the doomed ship. "She lives," Nero hissed, "because you failed. Now finish it." Anicetus bowed low, his expression unreadable. "As you command, Caesar." That night, a small band of armed men approached Agrippina's villa. The sea was calm again, eerily so, as though it waited to witness history. Agrippina's servant, Creperius, tried to bar the door, but the soldiers forced their way inside. Agrippina rose from her couch, weak but regal. The moonlight fell upon her face like a crown of ice. "You come for me," she said. "Tell my son I expected nothing less." When Anicetus entered, she looked him in the eye, not with fear, but pity. "Strike to my womb," she said, her voice steady. "For it bore such a monster." The blow fell. The room filled with silence. In the palace miles away, Nero waited for the messenger. When the words came, "It is done," he exhaled as if he had been holding his breath his entire life. But in the echo of that breath, he heard it, the faintest sound, like water lapping against stone. The sea again. His mother's sea. That night, Nero could not close his eyes. Every time he tried, he saw the moon reflected in black water, and her face beneath it, whispering his name. After Agrippina's death, the empire seemed to hold its breath. Nero gave no public mourning, no funeral rites. Instead, he ordered offerings to the gods, a grotesque theater meant to disguise what everyone already knew. Rome watched its emperor smile too widely, speak too fast. The senators bowed, the people cheered, but beneath it all, the air grew colder. At night, Nero's chambers filled with silence so deep it pressed against his chest. He dreamed of the sea, always the sea, calm at first, then boiling, as a figure rose from the waves with eyes that burned green like salt in flame. Her lips moved, but the words were always the same. "I forgive you." He woke screaming. His physicians whispered of exhaustion, his servants burned incense to chase away the spirits. But the whispers spread faster than the smoke. "Agrippina haunts the emperor's sleep." Seneca tried to anchor him in reason. "You are Rome," the philosopher said. "You must not fear your shadow." But Nero only stared through him. "Rome," he murmured. "Rome killed her, not I." Days turned to weeks. The emperor's laughter became unpredictable, his kindness sharp-edged. He would weep at the sound of a lyre, then order an execution before the last note faded. He commissioned portraits, hundreds, demanding that the artists make him divine. But no matter how brightly they painted his halo, his eyes always seemed afraid. And somewhere deep inside, a voice he could not silence whispered, "If she forgave me, then she still watches me." To drown his ghosts, Nero built spectacles. Theaters, games, processions, endless noise to fill the silence of his mother's absence. He took to the stage himself, first in secret, then in triumph. the emperor of Rome, crowned in laurel, performing tragedies of gods who killed their kin. The crowd, fearful and fascinated, applauded until their hands bled. Yet in every audience, Nero imagined her face among the thousands, pale, amused, patient. When he sang of Orestes, who murdered his mother, he swore he saw Agrippina's eyes glint in the torchlight. When he played the lyre, he could almost hear her humming with him, offbeat but near. His court began to tremble beneath his moods. Poppaea, his lover, became his moon, soothing his madness, feeding it in turn. She told him he was destined for greatness beyond Rome itself. That his mother had been a relic, a chain. And so he began to believe that the gods themselves had wanted her gone. Still, the people whispered. They called her a martyr now, Agrippina Divina, the mother betrayed. Her name painted on walls, carved into marble by unseen hands. One night, after a performance, Nero looked at his reflection, painted, crowned, adored, and whispered, "Am I her son, or a ghost?" The mirror offered no answer. Only the faint echo of waves far away, breaking against unseen shores. Rome glittered as if nothing could touch it. But beneath the marble and music, cracks began to whisper through its bones. Famine followed failed harvests, coins lost their worth, provinces muttered of revolt. And still, Nero sang. The Senate grew cautious, speaking in circles to avoid his wrath. Governors delayed their reports. The Praetorians, once loyal, began to trade glances that lasted too long. Rumor had become a weapon sharper than any sword. At night, Nero wandered the corridors of his palace, barefoot, a lamp trembling in his hand. He passed frescoes of gods devouring their kin, eyes flicking toward him as he moved. In his private theater, he ordered the musicians to play until dawn. He said silence reminded him too much of death. One evening, as thunder rolled across the Tiber, Nero summoned an astrologer from Greece. The men read the stars and fell silent. "Speak," Nero demanded. "Sire, the heavens say your reign burns bright. But stars that burn too brightly leave only ash." Nero smiled, thin as a blade. "Then I will make the ash beautiful." He declared a festival unlike any Rome had seen, a celebration of eternal fire, divine music, rebirth through flame. The people prepared garlands. The streets filled with anticipation. And then, in the warm night of July, the city began to burn. It started in the shops near the Circus Maximus. Flames leapt from wooden stalls, climbed up the walls, and ran through the city like red serpents. Within hours, the air itself seemed to burn. Nero watched from his palace on the Palatine Hill as the city he called eternal turned into a storm of light. His courtiers trembled. Some said he wept, others swore he laughed. No one could tell which was true. He ordered aid, then cancelled it. He opened the field of Mars to refugees, then closed the gates. And when the cries of the dying reached his balcony, he took up his lyre. "Let it be sung," he said softly, "that Rome perish to music worthy of her." He played as the fire devoured temples, homes, and the shrines of gods older than his name. When the wind shifted and the smoke reached his balcony, he did not flinch. He sang of Troy's fall, of divine vengeance, of heroes reborn from ruin. When dawn came, half the city lay in ashes. People whispered that the emperor himself had set the fire, that he longed to see a new Rome rise from the embers, a city shaped in his image. The whispers became belief. The belief became fury. And for the first time, Nero realized, the applause that once drowned his doubts had turned into silence. After the fire, Rome was a city of ghosts and whispers. Nero walked through the charred streets, his purple robe trailing like a shadow of his former glory. The people no longer cheered, they watched him with eyes sharpened by fear and sorrow. Fires had taken homes, but the embers had left memory, and anger, smoldering in every heart. Senators no longer flattered him, some whispered treason. Governors sent urgent letters detailing revolts in Gaul and Britain. Even the Praetorian Guard began questioning his orders, their loyalty fraying like rope under strain. Nero, once the golden boy of Rome, felt the empire slip like sand through his fingers. In his private theater, he sought refuge. Musicians played, actors performed, yet even their applause felt hollow. Poppaea, always near, whispered words of comfort, yet her eyes betrayed unease. Rome cannot always be tamed with song, she murmured. Nero's mind turned to shadows, visions of Agrippina, of bright Nicus, of every figure who had shaped his life. He saw betrayal in every glance, conspiracy in every gesture. The empire, he realized, was no longer his playground, it had become a hall of mirrors, reflecting all his fears and regrets. By night, he ordered spies to report on every citizen, senator, and soldier. Loyalty would be measured. Fear would replace love. And in the echoing halls of his palace, the whispers began again, louder this time, sharper, warning him that power alone could not command peace. Within the palace, Nero's court became a stage of tension and suspicion. Advisors argued in hushed voices, servants carried secrets in their eyes, and every new face could conceal a dagger. Poppaea urged him to act decisively, to punish those who whispered, to assert his dominion. Seneca counseled caution, advocating reason over fury. Burrus, torn between loyalty and fear, tried to hold the guard in check. But Nero could not see reason clearly, every word, every movement was filtered through the lens of paranoia. He began holding secret meetings, convening only those he could trust completely, and even then, suspicion gnawed at him. Nights grew longer, sleep rarer. Rome's golden boy, adored by the masses, now felt alone on a throne that seemed increasingly to weigh more than his body could bear. One evening, Nero sat alone on the balcony overlooking the Tiber, the city's charred remains visible beneath a pale moon. He strummed his lyre slowly, each note a sigh. He realized that the people no longer followed him for love, but for fear. And he wondered if fear could ever build an empire. The wind brought distant cries, rumors of rebellion, whispers of senators plotting, and murmurs that Britannicus's death had sown seeds not yet reaped. The young emperor understood, with a chill he could not shake, that Rome was alive, and it was angry. By midsummer, the tension in Rome had become unbearable. Senators whispered behind gilded doors, governors plotted in distant provinces, and the Praetorians looked upon their young emperor with a mixture of awe and fear. Every message that reached Nero carried a weight heavier than gold, rumors, half-truths, and veiled threats that made his nights sleepless. Nero began to distrust even those closest to him. Papia's comforting words sometimes felt like manipulation. Seneca's calm counsel began to sound like subtle criticism. Every gesture, every glance, became a test of loyalty. The boy who once sang for joy now sang to mask the trembling inside. One night, he summoned his advisors secretly to the private chambers. "Tell me who among you plots against me," he demanded, voice low and cold. The men exchanged nervous glances, silence stretching like a drawn bowstring. "Speak." Nero insisted, eyes flashing like lightning. No one spoke. The young emperor's anger festered. He decided to take matters into his own hands, instituting nightly patrols and secret interrogations. Rome's streets, once alive with the laughter of citizens, now echoed with suspicion and the soft whispers of those who feared the emperor's wrath. Through it all, the shadow of his mother's memory haunted him. He imagined Agrippina watching from the ashes of her villa, judging, waiting. And though she was gone, her presence lingered in every creaking floorboard, every flickering torch. The empire was fracturing under the weight of fear, and Nero, consumed by it, was both the architect and prisoner of this new world. The weeks turned into months, and Nero's mind began to twist under the relentless pressure. Paranoia became his constant companion, painting enemies in every face, treachery in every gesture. Courtiers and servants alike walked on eggshells, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to glance too long. The young emperor sought solace in the arts, yet even this could not calm him. He attended plays not as a spectator but as a scrutinizer, judging each actor for subtle signs of betrayal. He composed music that trembled with tension, each note a reflection of his fraying mind. In private, he spoke to the shadows as if they were conspirators. "Tell me," he whispered to the empty chamber, "who plots against me tonight?" The only answer was the flicker of candlelight, dancing on the walls like specters of the past. Even Poppaea began to fear him. "You must rest," she pleaded. "Rome needs you alive, not consumed." But her words fell on deaf ears. Nero had tasted the sharp sweetness of power, and now he could not distinguish between love and fear, truth and illusion. The empire, once golden and eternal, trembled beneath the weight of one boy's growing madness. And as night after night passed, Nero began to wonder if the ghosts of Rome, and of his own family, were real, or merely the reflection of his own unraveling. By the dawn of another scorching Roman summer, Nero's court had become a labyrinth of lies and whispers. Every counselor, every servant, every guard might carry a dagger in their heart. The young emperor walked the palace halls alone, his purple robe brushing the marble, his mind threading through shadows that were as real to him as the sun above. He convened secret councils, masked meetings where allies and enemies alike trembled under his gaze. Each decision became a trap, a test of loyalty, a measure of the empire's obedience. He questioned governors and generals, demanding reports not only of events but of thoughts, fears, and desires. Those who failed even in subtle tone disappeared quietly, their absence a reminder of what dissent might cost. Poppaea remained near him, her words sweet yet calculating. "Fear can rule men more surely than love," she whispered one night, her hand brushing his. Nero nodded, the thought taking root deeper in his heart. He saw Rome not as a city of citizens but as a stage, with himself both playwright and actor, master and prisoner. Even the Praetorians began to feel the tightening grip of suspicion. Orders came silently, masks of loyalty worn over hearts pounding with dread. Nero's once vibrant world had transformed into a theater of shadows, where every glance could ignite flames and every whisper might be treachery. And in the quiet hours, Nero remembered his mother. Agrippina had taught him cunning, patience, and calculation, but he now feared the brilliance she had instilled. He realized, with a shiver, that her influence still haunted him, guiding his hand even as he sought to escape it. The first strike came not with the sword, but with fear. A prominent senator, one who had questioned Nero's lavish spending, was found dead in his villa, a poisoned goblet nearby. Rome whispered, and the streets grew quieter. The people no longer dared speak their minds in the forum, and even the taverns hummed with cautious voices. Nero observed the fear like a sculptor studying clay. He did not rejoice, but he understood its power. Power, he realized, was no longer in gold or in law, it lived in terror, subtle and omnipresent. That evening, he summoned Poppaea and his closest advisors to the palace theater. Candles flickered across frescoed walls depicting gods and heroes. Nero spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, and of Rome's future. His voice was steady, but his eyes glinted with something untamed. Rome is a living thing, he said. It must be guided, even if it resists. And those who resist will fall. The advisors bowed, fearful, and Poppaea smiled faintly. She knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the city murmured. Rome had not yet seen the full measure of its emperor. And in the shadows of its streets, whispers carried the scent of coming chaos, the empire's pulse quickened, and the boy who had become God now fed on fear to stay alive. By this point, Nero's court was a tinderbox. Trust had become a currency more valuable than gold, yet rarer than any gem. Advisors whispered to each other in corners, spies observed spies, and servants moved like shadows, careful not to draw attention. Each smile, each gesture was measured, nothing was innocent. Nero's paranoia deepened. Every report of dissent, no matter how small, became proof of conspiracy. Governors from distant provinces sent letters urging restraint, fearing the emperor's wrath, while others used the opportunity to curry favor. The Praetorians, uneasy but obedient, shifted like reeds in a storm. Poppaea remained at Nero's side, her presence both comforting and dangerous. Fear is necessary, she reminded him one night as they walked the balcony overlooking the Tiber. But do not let it consume you entirely. Nero's response was a quiet, hollow laugh. Fear is all I have learned, he said. And it teaches more than love ever could. Rome's people began to notice. Where once they celebrated the boy emperor, now they bowed in cautious silence. Even the artists and musicians who once flourished under Nero's patronage tread lightly, wary that a misplaced word might cost them everything. And yet, in the shadows of his palace, Nero felt alive in a way he had never known. Power, absolute and unchallenged, coursed through him, but with it came isolation, and a sense that every bond was temporary, every ally a potential traitor. Beyond the palace walls, the empire's foundations trembled. Provinces murmured about mismanagement, taxes grew heavier, and whispers of revolt traveled along the roads from Britain to Gaul. The fire that Nero had orchestrated years ago had left scars on the city, both physical and psychological, and the people's patience was thinning. Nero remained absorbed in his theater and music, retreating further from reality. But he was aware, almost too acutely, of the rumblings of rebellion. Letters arrived at night, warning of senators who plotted openly, and governors who whispered promises of loyalty while secretly rallying troops. One evening, as Nero reclined in his private theater, he overheard a conversation between two advisors. "If the emperor cannot control Rome," one whispered, "the people will choose another." Nero's smile was cold. He rose, his shadow stretching along the frescoed walls. "Then they will see," he said, "that no one commands Rome but me." The first overt signs of revolt emerged subtly. A soldier defied orders, a courier delayed critical messages, and a city official ignored a direct command. Nero's rage, once restrained by fear of optics, now flared openly. Executions followed, not of those plotting, but of those who might. Rome's streets were filled with tension, and the air smelled of smoke and suspicion. Nero knew the rebellion had only just begun, and in the depths of his mind, a darker voice whispered that the empire's collapse might come from the very hands he had once trusted. The unrest in Rome could no longer be contained. Nero, increasingly consumed by fear and ambition, resolved to assert his dominance in the most visible way. He ordered grand public spectacles, ostensibly to celebrate the gods, but the true purpose was control, a reminder that the emperor could summon awe, terror, and spectacle all at once. The Colosseum became a stage not just for gladiators, but for public displays of authority. Soldiers marched with precision, citizens watched in tense silence. Nero, seated high in his golden throne, observed with a detached fascination. Every cheer, every gasp, fed the intoxicating power that coursed through him. Yet beyond the city, discontent festered. Governors and local officials whispered about rebellion, small uprisings began in the provinces, and Rome's allies questioned the stability of the emperor's rule. Letters of warning reached Nero nightly, each one a blade against his fragile certainty. Poppaea, ever the voice of strategy, encouraged him to act decisively. "Strike first," she urged. "Let fear be your sword, and no one will dare challenge you." Nero, eyes gleaming with a mixture of calculation and madness, agreed. He dispatched secret squads to enforce obedience, eliminate dissent quietly, and instill terror. The streets of Rome grew colder at night, shadowed not only by darkness but by the weight of the emperor's omnipresent gaze. And still, in his private chambers, Nero heard echoes of Agrippina, a mother's voice that haunted even the most lavish spectacles, reminding him that fear could never fully erase the past. By the following months, the consequences of Nero's reign began to ripple outward. Provinces resisted. Soldiers mutinied. Governors withheld taxes, citing confusion or fear. Rome's trade suffered as caravans were ambushed by bandits emboldened by imperial chaos. Inside the palace, Nero paced endlessly. Reports arrived daily, each one worse than the last. Yet he could not slow, could not hesitate. The empire had become a living puzzle of threats, and each day required decisions that threatened his sanity. At night, he composed music meant to soothe his soul, yet each melody echoed with discord. The lyre, once a source of comfort, now reflected the turbulence of his mind. Poppaea tried to console him, reminding him of his power, but her reassurances were thin shields against the storm of doubt and paranoia. Nero began to see enemies everywhere, in the Senate, in the streets, in the very walls of his palace. No corner of Rome was safe from suspicion. Every whisper felt like a conspiracy, every glance like accusation. The city trembled under his rule, and the young emperor, once adored and celebrated, now ruled through fear alone. The empire, vast and rich, showed its first real cracks, and Nero, blinded by ambition and haunted by memory, could not see how close he was to losing everything. By now, the empire's unrest had become undeniable. Provinces once loyal now teetered on rebellion, governors whispered about raising armies in secret, and the Praetorian Guard's loyalty was strained by fear and mistrust. Nero, sensing the shifting tides, withdrew further into his palace, seeking the safety of shadows and private councils. Each day brought news of minor uprisings. Gaul refused to pay taxes, Britain murmured about defiance, and even the streets of Rome were restless. Nero grew increasingly paranoid, suspecting that every courier, every soldier, every citizen might carry a dagger meant for him. The empire's pulse had become erratic, and he could feel it in his bones. Poppaea continued to advise him, encouraging boldness, yet even she trembled at the subtle cracks she could see forming around the emperor. "Rome is fraying," she warned. "Move carefully, or the threads will snap." Nero, consumed by fear and the desire to dominate, decided that he would act before his enemies could. He summoned loyal troops, ready to quell uprisings with force, while secretly orchestrating the elimination of any senator or official who might challenge him. Every action was calculated, yet each carried the risk of igniting further rebellion. The young emperor walked the palace corridors at night, listening to the whispers of his own mind, haunted by the memory of Agrippina and the faces of those he had betrayed. The empire, vast and vibrant, was now a powder keg, and Nero held the match. The first real spark of open defiance came when a faction of the Senate openly condemned Nero's excesses and cruelty. Soldiers loyal to the provinces refused to follow imperial orders, and rumors of a coordinated rebellion began to circulate. Rome itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of impending chaos. Nero's reaction was swift and brutal, not yet in full violence, but in psychological warfare. Spies were dispatched, informants planted, and fear carefully cultivated. Every corner of the city became a stage where loyalty was tested, and hesitation could mean death. But even as he acted decisively, the cracks widened. Governors ignored his commands, troops mutinied quietly, the citizens whispered in marketplaces, in taverns, and in the shadows of temples. The emperor's fear grew alongside the empire's unrest. Alone in his chambers, Nero confronted the reflection in his polished mirror. The boy who once sang with joy now looked at a stranger, pale, restless, haunted by memory and ambition alike. He strummed the lyre, but the music rang hollow, echoing in empty halls. The empire teetered. Rome, magnificent and eternal, stood on the precipice. And Nero, once adored and celebrated, felt the cold, undeniable weight of his isolation. Rebellion ignited across the empire like wildfire. Provinces rose in defiance, soldiers refused orders, and Rome itself murmured with fear and expectation. Nero's advisors urged him to flee or negotiate, but he could not accept compromise. Power, once intoxicating, now demanded obedience at any cost. The emperor dispatched loyal legions to suppress uprisings, yet each action seemed to feed the flames of revolt. Governors who once bowed in loyalty now whispered of installing a new ruler. Even the praetorians hesitated, torn between fear of Nero and the desire to survive. Inside the palace, Nero's nights became endless. He wandered shadowed corridors, listening to whispers and imagining conspiracies in every corner. Poppaea tried to soothe him, but the air between them grew tense, fraught with unspoken fears. Nero realized that even love could not anchor him against the storm he had unleashed. Rome teetered on the edge. Fires of rebellion flared in distant provinces, carrying rumors of his mother's ghost and the emperor's impending downfall. Nero understood, with a chill that no music could soothe, that the empire's fate was now entwined with his own unraveling mind. Nero found himself isolated as never before. Allies vanished, enemies multiplied, and the city he once ruled with adoration now viewed him with suspicion and dread. Reports of mutinies, uprisings, and betrayals filled his nights, each one a dagger to his sanity. He spent hours in the private theater, composing music meant to calm his fears, but each note became a reflection of his inner chaos. Shadows stretched long across frescoed walls, flickering like ghostly reminders of Agrippina, bright Nicus, and the citizens whose lives he had shaped and destroyed. Poppaea's reassurances could not pierce the growing void. Nero felt the empire slipping through his fingers, each city, each province, each citizen a mirror of his failures. The boy who had once commanded Rome with charm and song now ruled with fear, haunted by memory and the consequences of his own ambition. Even the people whispered of his madness. Tales of the burning city, the unjust executions, and the emperor's erratic behavior spread from Rome to the provinces. Fear could no longer mask weakness. The empire sensed it, its emperor, brilliant and terrifying, was faltering. Rome stood at the precipice. Rebellion flared openly, senators defied orders, the provinces resisted. Nero, alone in his golden palace, realized that the empire he had inherited and shaped was slipping beyond control. He wandered the palace halls at night, recalling the faces of those he had lost, his mother, his friends, the citizens who had once cheered. The lyre in his hands trembled, echoing the turmoil within. Every note was a farewell, every chord a confession. Poppaea's voice urged calm, yet even she sensed that the moment had passed. The empire had grown beyond one man, and the illusions of control, power, and fear could no longer hold it together. Nero's final days were spent in reflection and madness, a blend of brilliance and terror. The empire survived, scarred and reshaped, carrying the legacy of a boy who sang, who feared, and who ruled through both charm and cruelty. And in the whispers of Rome, through the centuries, the story endured, of a young emperor haunted by ghosts, a mother who could not be silenced, and a city that lived on, remembering both glory and tragedy. And so, our story comes to rest. The empire endured, but the echoes of its young emperor's life linger, reminding us that even greatness carries shadows. Thank you for listening tonight. If this journey through history soothed your mind and stirred your curiosity, please subscribe and stay with us for more historical sleep stories. Close your eyes, let the past fade gently into dreams, and remember, every whisper of history carries its own secret.